The clerk will report the amendment.
The senator from Pennsylvania, Mr. Toomey, proposes an amendment.
And I'll ask unanimous consent that the reading be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And I'd like to ask unanimous consent to add Senator Vitter as a co-sponsor of this amendment.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise to introduce an amendment to retain Senate confirmation process for two positions, the position of governor and alternate governor of the IMF and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The Board of Governors at the IMF is the highest level of governance of the IMF, and currently the governor and the alternate governor are both subject to Senate confirmation. This bill would change that. This bill would remove them from the Senate confirmation process, and I think I understand the rationale behind that thinking. It's probably because by custom the U.S. has appointed the Secretary of the Treasury as the governor designate to the IMF and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve as the alternate governor. And so since those folks have already been through a Senate confirmation process, no doubt the thought was that we didn't need to have a separate one. Here's the reason for my amendment, and that is that the decision to appoint these two individuals to these two posts has been by custom, and there's nothing in statute or otherwise that requires the president to appoint these two individuals. The president, any future president, could choose to nominate anyone he or she may like, and I think it's very important that in that event, the Senate would continue to have the oversight that comes with the advice and consent that my amendment would retain. The truth is that the U.S. is the largest lender to the IMF, and right now the IMF is in the process of using U.S. taxpayer dollars to bail out Greece and perhaps other countries. At a time when Greece and Europe are virtually drowning in debt, I don't think the Senate should be conceding its confirmation authority and potentially thereby reducing its oversight over the key IMF officials responsible for overseeing tens of billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars. I think we all know the United States doesn't even have its own fiscal house in order, and yet here we are giving many tens, over $100 billion to the IMF for them to in turn lend money to insolvent governments. This doesn't make a lot of sense to me. We're running a $1.5 trillion deficit, nearly 10% of our entire economy. Our debt is now up to 69% of our GDP, and it's rising rapidly. It just seems to me that American taxpayers shouldn't be asked, excuse me, American taxpayers shouldn't be asked to bail out European governments that clearly haven't been able to get their act together. But recently, we actually expanded the liability that U.S. taxpayers have to the IMF. Let me comment for a minute specifically on this idea of bailing out Greece, because I think this is a very, very bad idea. Greek debt now exceeds 150% of their total economy. The Brookings Institute estimates that bribery and corruption alone amount to 8% of GDP annually. The Greek workforce has a very low productivity rate. There's a very low percentage of their population that are engaged in the workforce. By any measure, this is an economy that is in a downward spiral. But despite that, and despite a $160 billion bailout just last May, in 2011, the Greek government decided to increase their total expenditures. So while running this staggering and completely unsustainable deficit, their government's decision was to increase spending. Well, the fact of the matter is, unfortunately, no loan, no matter how large and no matter from whom it comes, no loan is going to solve Greece's problems. It's not that Greece has a problem with liquidity. The problem with Greece is solvency. Greece simply is insolvent. Greece cannot, and therefore it will not, repay all of its debt. And the danger of going down this road of having these multinationals, like whether it's the European Central Bank or the IMF, in lending money to Greece now, what we're effectively doing is replacing the existing loans that have been provided by private banks, especially European banks, with taxpayer dollars provided by these big institutions. Eventually, the Greek government is going to default on the debt. The only question is, upon whose debt do they default? Will it be that of the private banks that lent them the money, as I believe it ought to be? Those are the people that made an imprudent credit decision when they extended money to a fundamentally insolvent government. Or will it be taxpayer-funded institutions because those institutions have taken out the debt of the private banks? I'm afraid that's where we're heading, and that's going to include U.S. taxpayer dollars on the path that we're on. I think this is a big mistake. It's an unusual transaction for the IMF, unusual primarily for two reasons. One, it's unusual for the IMF to lend money to developed economies. Usually this kind of program goes to developing nations, but it's even more unusual in the magnitude, the sheer scale of this. In 2010, the IMF bailout to Greece was more than 3,000% of Greece's IMF quota. Typically, the size of loans like this are no more than 200 to 600% of the nation's quota. This was 3,000%. But one of the biggest problems with going down this road of having multinational institutions bailing out insolvent countries is the moral hazard. You see, right now there are a number of countries around Europe that are in substantial trouble, varying degrees of fiscal problems, and some teetering on the edge of insolvency. What's the message that we're sending to those governments if multinationals come in and bail out Greece? The message is, don't make the tough decisions now and impose the kind of austerity that they desperately need, because someday someone will come along and bail you out of this problem. I think that's a very, very bad policy. And most of all, we ought not to be putting U.S. taxpayers in this position of taking on this liability, which, as I say, much of which I'm afraid is not going to be repaid. Now, the reality is Congress has very limited oversight over the IMF by design, very limited authority. But one of the few checks that we do have is the ability to provide or to withhold our consent with respect to those who are nominated to that powerful governing board. I just don't think at a time when the IMF is going out and putting tens of billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars at risk, bailing out irresponsible and insolvent foreign countries, at a time like this, I don't think we should be doing anything to relinquish that authority that we have, to diminish the opportunity that we would have to provide that advice and consent. And Mr. President, with that, I will yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.